think we're all going through a very terrible time at this point. There's a lot of pain around all of us, and a lot of families have been devastated. We know, there are children who are living in fear. There are families, who've lost loved ones. There are children who probably don't have anybody to reach out to, especially right now in a, where there is no online school going on. If they are in difficulty, there are places, as remote as we know in this country, where it's even difficult to reach out to anybody. So our prayers are with everyone who's suffering in some way or the other in this period. And I hope that all of us here join in together in these prayers and think of everyone around us. We've lost a few of our educator friends, and all we can say is, pray for all of it to get over soon. How much ever we know that it's going to still take time. So, thank you for joining in today. And thank you for joining in large numbers as well. I think most of you know Adhyayan, but a quick introduction to Adhyayan is that we are a community of educators who strongly believe that every child, irrespective of the geographical location, socioeconomic background, is entitled to a good school. And our definition of a good school is research-based, holistic, includes the voice of all stakeholders. And we work closely with school managements and school leaders to chart out their journeys to higher and higher levels of quality. The first lockdown kickstarted this collaborative space, the community of practice, which runs on 2 Saturdays a month. And we've seen this community grow steadily to close to now about 4,000 educators. And today is the 29th session and the beginning of a 3-part webinar series. I think the schools between the 2 lockdowns, have completed like 1 full academic year. With the new year already begun for some schools, and for some it's around the corner. And this year, 2020, the past year, 2020, has seen 2 major changes that have impacted the Indian education. One, of course, is COVID, and the other is the National Education Policy of 2020. So as educators, we've welcomed the National Education Policy, and we've even spoken about this on various occasions, because we've seen that it's a very progressive and there's a paradigm shift in several ways. One of the main focus areas being on, the foundational literacy and numeracy. And you would definitely understand that that's why we have chosen foundational literacy and numeracy as the topic for today. So the National Education Policy, as you know, speaks about attaining foundational literacy and numeracy by grade 3. And this is to be achieved by 2025. So hence this 3-part webinar series that's starting today is focusing on what good literacy learning looks like, what good numeracy learning looks like in the second, today is the 8th May, second session on 22nd May talks about what good numeracy learning looks like. And the third one talks about what good leadership and management of numeracy and literacy looks like. And we know that leadership is essential and is key to the support that is required for any change to happen. So, sorry. The emphasis is also the fact on, the fact is that if functional literacy and numeracy, once that is achieved, actually achieving other goals that the National Education Policy has set out to would seem very closer to achieve. And at this point, I think you can see a poll. Annette, can we have the poll on everyone's screen to get your views on this?
Yes, we've launched the poll. I can respond to it.
Okay, I hope you can see the polls. Just any a thumbs up if you can see the poll, because I'm not able to see the poll.
I can't see it, Neha.
Annette,
Not
we've,
yet, Neha.
yeah, I don't think it's,
Is it visible?
no.
No.
If you click on the polling button at the bottom, I think it.
Yes, it says the poll is launched, but it's
We can now see
Yes,
that.
I got it now. Yeah. Can everyone see that? Yes, I can see people responding to it as well. Great, we can all see it. Yes, Annette, we can end the poll and share the results. Annette?
sorry, I think there's some error which is coming up, so I cannot share the results.
Okay, we are able to see the results now. So 65% say yes. Critical thinking can be taught through literacy. 33% said somewhat can be taught to a certain extent, and 2% say it's difficult. Thank you for your views. And I'd like to just give a few introductions and start off the session, because there's a lot that we want to hear and a lot that we want to discuss and talk. So the panelist for today's session on what good literacy learning looks like, we have Tom Power, Kay Jacob, and Claire Hedges. So I'm going to take around a minute, probably more than a minute, because I think if I have to do justice to their rich experience that they bring to this table, we all need to know what has their journey been through. And on that note, I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Kavita, the founder of Adhyayan and Adhyayan Foundation, Adhyayan Services and Adhyayan Foundation, and my team members at Adhyayan, that's Gauri, Shruti, and Annette. So let me introduce Kay. Kay comes from a family of teachers, her parents being teachers in the United States. Kay has graduated from the University of Minnesota with a degree in secondary language arts and arts education. Kay has varied teaching experience, starting from teaching in the US, spending 2 decades working in excellent schools in Tokyo, which is what she says. They are excellent schools in Tokyo, among some of the finest colleagues and the most motivated students that she could ever imagine. That must have been a wonderful experience, Kay. She then returned to the US and completed her master's degree in educational policy and administration with a major in comparative and international development education. Her love for adventure and learning about new cultures led her to Woodstock School in India in 2003 and then to Egypt. After 3 years in Egypt, Kay returned to India, where she served as the principal of the Heritage School in Gurgaon. One of the highlights during her tenure was they set out to prove that a mainstream Indian school could achieve high results on the board exams without compromising the deep search for, understanding and even commitment, to an authentic project-based learning. So Kay is going to share some of her experiences of how they managed to do that, because I'm sure a lot of us want to hear that. After over 30 years of work in schools outside the United States, Kay returned to her roots in the Midwest, this time to Maharishi School, a small but highly diverse international boarding school in Iowa. So Kay is joining us from there, and it's, I think, 6 a.m. in the morning. So good morning, Kay. Here, Kay is the academic director and head of the middle school and upper schools. And in Kay's words, one constant throughout my career is that I have been a teaching administrator exploring more effective ways to enhance students' skills and interest in literacy and language arts. So thank you, Kay, for making it today and making it early on a Saturday morning.
Oh, my pleasure. It's good to be with you all.
Thank you. And now introducing Tom. Tom Power has over 20 years of experience in design and delivery of EdTech enhanced teacher development research and program delivery in the Global South. He leads the International Teacher Education for Development Research Group at the Open University. His research is at the intersection of mobile learning, teacher education, and international developing developing innovative approaches that are capable of large scale, low unit cost, high impact, and excellent value for money. In his role as academic director of the FDCO funded English in Action program in Bangladesh, which was from 2008 to 18, he led a team of national and international researchers to conceptualize, design, and deliver this £3 million research monitoring and evaluation component. And Claire was also a part of this project, and they've been rated as A++, which tested the effectiveness of the model of EdTech enhanced school-based teacher continuous professional development from proof of concept to national scale. And that's like really rich experience. His most recent research project funded by EdTech Hub evaluated how mobile phones supported children's learning during COVID-19 in Zimbabwe. Tom's work has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Professional Development in Education, Transforming Government, People, Process, and Policy, the Curriculum Journal, and Open Learning, the Journal of Open Distance Learning. Tom has been a regular presenter at Commonwealth of Learning, MLearn, and eLearn Africa, and has been invited to speak on teacher education, education technology, and international development at Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard universities. It's a pleasure to have you today, Tom. Thank you for making it, and I know how busy you and Claire have been in these recent times.
Our pleasure, thank you.
And Claire has over 15 years of international teacher development and program management experience in a national English language education and teacher professional development program in Bangladesh. The external project completion review carried out by DFID rated this project, the research monitoring and evaluation component of the Open University, led by the Open University, and specifically Tom Power and Claire's at A++, substantially exceeding expectations. So I think that really deserves appreciation. Previously, the founder program manager for the Open University's teacher education in the Sub-Saharan Africa program, establishing a network of teacher education institutions working across 9 countries in Africa. Claire's leading role on the implementation of school-based programs, approaches, and resources into existing and new teacher professional developments through on-costing open and distance teacher education examples across the Sub-Saharan Africa. And this project, that's called the TESSA project, has received the Queen's Anniversary Prize for Higher Education. Congratulations, Claire, and thank you very much for making it today.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for being here. It's a real pleasure and privilege.
So you can see the, I'm sure, like the rich experience that all our 3 panelists bring to us today. There's a lot to learn from them, and I'm sure we want to ask them also. So the flow of the session is that we will hear our panelists talk about their rich experience in this area, What is literacy? Why does it matter? What does good teaching of literacy look like? How do you teach literacy, basically? And also, all of this would be through the case studies that they would like to share with us. So we invite all of you, the audience that's here on Zoom as well as on YouTube Live, to use the chat to put down your questions and thoughts as the session progresses. We will take up the questions in the last 15 minutes of the session, and we may be able to answer some even during the session. Yeah, so let's begin with the basic question right now. And Annette will share the Mentimeter link in the chat. Annette, just give me a heads up if you've shared that.
Yes, Neha.
Thank you. So there's a Mentimeter link in the chat. Kindly access the Mentimeter link. There's a simple question as to what is literacy. Annette, will you be able to share the screen? So lots of words coming across here. You can see reading, leading the way, ability to read and write, reading, language. So read and write, again, ability to write. We can see subsets of the same as many other words. It's interesting to see the word wall develop, right? So as we're putting this on, I mean, you can still continue. We've got 51 responses and more can definitely add. Would invite Tom to actually take this on to say, what is literacy, Tom? Over to you.
Okay, I've taken a screenshot of that when you said 51, so I'm just going to have a look. I mean, I think it's really interesting in people's responses to this. You know, I think communication was the biggest word for a while, and then it became reading, and it seems reading is what we think about, reading and the ability to read and write. I'm really interested in some of the smaller words, some of the less popular words in here. And we've got power to learn, critical thinking, communicating, understanding, autonomy. And I think some of it's really interesting, isn't it, that it seems like most people are agreed it's about reading and writing, but actually there's also these other things in play that suggest quite a different kind of view of literacy, and it being about kind of capability and understanding and ability to change your life. And I think that's a really nice kind of segue into the brief presentation that Claire and I are going to share. And Neha, would you like us to start that now? So let me see if I can
Yeah, we'll stop sharing the screen. Yes.
share my screen.
Yeah, go ahead.
And hopefully this will work. I'm never 100% confident on these things. There we go. And if I click present there, I hope that are you now
Yes.
seeing the slide? Fantastic,
we
Neha,
are.
that's great. Okay. And I'll start a little timer just to kind of keep us on track. And I think we're talking for 20 minutes. Is that right?
Yes.
Fantastic.
So,
So-
can I spotlight Claire as well, if you together? Is that how you'd like it, Tom?
Fantastic, yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Neha. So,
Thank you.
oh, it's not moving on. Hang on a sec. Yes. So we're just going to talk briefly about three things over the next 20 minutes. I'm going to start by talking about what is literacy and why does it matter. Claire is then going to share an example of a case study from the work that that Claire has been doing in Zimbabwe on supporting adolescent girls' education. If there is time, I might briefly mention another case study from our work in Zimbabwe, but if there isn't, we'll press on and go straight to reflections and questions. So we'll just see how the time goes on that. And just before we move on from the slide, the photo on the left there shows some of the girls from the case study in Zimbabwe. So when we're talking about adolescent girls, these are the people that we're talking about. And I just want to start off by spending a few minutes thinking about what we mean by literacy. And I think that word cloud that we had was really helpful, showing, you know, fundamentally there's a view there that it's about reading or reading and writing, but actually there are lots of other definitions and meanings that are associated with this. And in the 2016 Global Monitoring Report, they identified four different definitions of literacy that had been used very commonly worldwide over the previous decades. And I'm not framing them in exactly the same way as that, but I just want to make that point that actually, when we talk about literacy, what we mean is contested, and the definitions have changed over time, and there are multiple competing views on what is meant by literacy. And one of the oldest and earliest definitions of literacy really position literacy as being about cognitive skills, about things like, you know, the kind of thing that you might do in grammar. Can I take, you know, the present tense and turn it into the past tense? Can I identify these letters and the letter sounds? So there are a set of cognitive skills, and really they're largely independent of the context in which the learner is situated. So you know, the letter sounds the same, or the word has the same meaning, you know, kind of regardless of what the situation is that you're in. And I'd just like to kind of illustrate this. This might be slightly unfair on the promoters of the video that I'm about to share. It's 2021. It's a recent English keyword wrap that is being used by a very popular program that we keep coming across. But I think it demonstrates this kind of context-independent notion. So the purpose of this wrap is really to help learners learn a range of words. And as far as I can see, there's very little kind of logic to what those words are. There's no kind of context in which the words are being used or meaning. It's just a lot of words. This is good practice. I'm just sharing it as an example, and I'm hoping you'll be able to hear this.
Story. Bird, rabbit, cat. Bird, rabbit, cat, kitten, duck, story. Chair, watch, dog. Chair, watch, dog, ladder, fish, coffee, dolphin.
I have no idea how they came to choose chair, watch, dog, dolphin, but you're just learning some words. There's no context for it. There's not really any meaning or application of those words. It's just let's learn this stuff, and that is kind of I think in some ways it's quite a crude example, but it just illustrates the lack of context in the learning of literacy that is being promoted there. I think, oh, it started again. Another approach that's quite different is that literacy is really about cognitive skills, but these are applied in context, and this is functional literacy. You know, UNESCO have defined that. Actually, I think the year's wrong on there. Sorry, I think it's older than 2017. But UNESCO defined functional literacy as someone is literate if they can engage in all the activities that are required for their own and for the community's development. So you get this notion that literacy isn't just about learning letters and words. It's about using those in particular activities in particular settings and having a purpose for them. So you're doing something that is going to contribute to your own development or to the development of your community. So literacy, the skills then become contextualized, but they also become purposeful. There's a reason why you want to use these skills for a particular purpose in a particular setting for yourself or the benefit of your community. And that's really quite a stark change from the focus just on cognitive skills. And that kind of functional literacy approach has been really quite prominent for a couple of decades now. There is another view that looks at literacy as skills for economic development. Neha mentioned the project that Claire and I co-led in Bangladesh for a decade, which was on English language and English language communication. And actually, both in terms of the government of Bangladesh and the UK government, that was positioned as being an economic development project. You know, the purpose of promoting literacy in English was so that the economic economy of Bangladesh would develop. And I think the government of Bangladesh looked across the border to India and saw things like the call centers and the growing economy and thought that English language literacy was a significant aspect of that was much weaker in Bangladesh, and they really wanted to address those as skills for development. So there's a narrative around that. And finally, I think the fourth way of thinking about literacy is as a way of developing critical understanding for your own change and for community change. And to my mind, this links to the work of Amartya Sen on capabilities. And literacy becomes a vehicle for helping people develop the capability to live a life that they've got reason to value. And those four things, they're all in contestation at the moment. The rap that I showed you at the beginning is current. That was only released this year. But generally speaking, there's been a trend that's moved from the left hand of the screen to the right hand. And the one on the right is kind of the most recent ways in which literacy is being framed and explored in academic circles and in policy. So how do people develop literacy? Well, in terms of learning, there are a number of activities that have been well evidenced as contributing to the development of foundation literacy. And actually, I think before we look at any of those in detail, sorry, there's a typo in there. I think one of the things that I want to point out is that actually a lot of this is not about reading and writing. So things like listening to and telling stories is an important part of literacy. The oral aspect, singing songs is an important way of developing literacy. Observing and talking about the world around you, naming, counting and drawing things. And looking at and reading picture books and that thing that even if you may not be able to read all of the text in a book, having the pictures and starting to make meaning are all important aspects of developing literacy skills. And in terms of teaching, this is very contested, and in some circles they've talked over a couple of decades about reading wars, and you know, there are people who strongly promote phonics as this is the way you learn, and you learn your letter sounds and the sounds of single and double and triple letters, and then we kind of put those letter sounds together and they make words, and that's how you learn. And that's how we're going to teach literacy. And in fairness, there are lots of projects around the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, that have used phonics approaches and shown really quite marked improvements in children's literacy skills in relatively short periods of time. I think there and USAID particularly promote phonics-based approaches to literacy. In competition with that is kind of multi-strategy approaches. And these are ones that yes, include phonics, but also have much wider and more flexible approaches. So phonics is there, but so is meaning making. So it's not just that you're learning the sounds of the words, it's really important you know what those words mean. It's really important that when you string words together in a sentence, you're not doing that as part of an academic exercise on changing the tense of a verb or something, but you're actually communicating something that has value to you. There's an emphasis on oral communication as well as written communication. And there's an emphasis on enjoyment, on reading for pleasure, on purposeful reading. And there's a lot of contention between those two different views. And finally, I just want to flag the issue of language. And this is drawing upon work that was done by UNESCO a few years ago. But if you look at all of the children in the world, as a rule, the vast majority of those children are multilingual. They're not monolingual. They have at least 2 languages, many 3 or 4. And sadly, most children in the world are taught in a language that isn't their mother tongue. So whatever languages they speak at home, when they go to school and they're learning literacy, they're learning in a second or often a third language. And the one that I find most shocking is that almost half, 40% of all of the children in the world are taught and assessed in a language that they neither speak nor understand. And so when we think about literacy and learning and teaching, it's really important that we bear in mind the issue of what language are we talking about? Is it the medium of instruction? Is it the mother tongue? Is it the second or even the third language of the child? And how do we help the child develop literacy in that language? And there's an awful lot of work now that quite strongly argues that even if at some point for various reasons you might want the child, it might be beneficial for the child to be literate in a second or a third language, that they will get there much more quickly and solidly if they first become literate in their mother tongue. And that's often not the case in many systems around the world. So I just wanted to do that to set the scene, and now I'm going to hand over to Claire to talk us through the case study of SAGE in Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Tom. And as Tom said earlier, SAGE is supporting adolescent girls' education. And it's aimed at vulnerable girls aged between 10 and 19 years in Zimbabwe. And these are girls who've never been to school or who dropped out before completing their basic education. And so these girls don't yet have foundational literacy and numeracy skills. But I think it's also relevant much more widely, this case study, because I mean, in Zimbabwe, many learners who are in school don't yet have those foundational skills. And that is true whether they are in infant school, upper primary, or lower secondary school. And so the government have endorsed this approach and materials for use in schools as well as for in non-formal education. And the programme also aligns with the non-formal education curriculum. So it's a coordinated programme of learning foundational skills in literacy, numeracy and English, also sort of life skills and vocational skills are covered, and it takes place in community learning hubs where learners are supported by print-based resources, so each learner gets a learner workbook, and by community educators who have session guides, a little bit like lesson plans. And many of these community educators are teacher training college graduates or retired teachers. And the image that you can see on the left-hand side is taken from one of the unit workbooks. And every unit has a unit story, and that story is inspired by girls. We get girls to write in, tell us what they're interested in. Sometimes they suggest their own stories. So they're inspired by the girls. They are relevant to the girls. So the in the image that we can see, well, Tom, can you just go back one, please? So the image that you just saw was a girl on using her mobile phone for a conversation in the city. And also they're inspiring to girls. So we have stories about girls running sort of dressmaking collectives, becoming a driver, doing some farming, improving farming. So they're all stories that we feel that actually help girls have ambition. And as with many education programs, as Tom says, SAGE works within a multilingual environment. The girls have different home languages, none of which are English. And I just thought it might be interesting to hear the lead literacy author just say a few words about the issues of language, medium and literacy levels as we've seen them in the SAGE programme. I wonder whether you could play the audio, Tom.
How has consideration of learners' language shaped the programme, material and learning support?
The team have also been mindful that even though the girls may not be experienced within formal education, they will, because they're aged 10 to 18, have been literacy users in their communities. So they will have engaged with speaking and listening in home language, for example. So it was really important that the programme started at this point of success and prior knowledge for the girls. So as part of that, when we were designing the programme, we knew that we wanted to include numeracy and literacy, but what we decided to do with literacy was to separate that out. So have a very clear distinction between when activities were literacy focused, which for us would be home language, and when they were focused on just learning English. So we've got 6 modules in the SAGE programme, and so our intention was to transition from literacy to English by the end of the 2-year programme, so across 6 modules. And so what that means in reality is that the girls hopefully finish the SAGE programme at about grade 5, whereas in Zimbabwe, the first 3 years that children are in school, so from grades 1 to 3, they're learning in home language and being taught English, and then they transition into English as the medium instruction in grade 4. So we took a slightly more flexible view on that, in that some of the girls, certainly girls who maybe are living on the borders with other countries who are potentially trading in English, might be more proficient in English than other girls. So we took a more flexible approach. So by the end of the programme, we wanted girls to be able to be confident in learning in English. So home language or vernacular is assumed in numeracy, as the focus is on girls' understanding of numeracy concepts, and that's reflected through the session guides that we have for the community educators, as well as for the girls' workbook. So each girl within the SAGE programme has their own workbook in front of them. That workbook is in English because lots of the activities in there are linked to the English activities, and it was really important for us that girls had a tangible resource in front of them so that they were seeing the English language written down. Within numeracy, we know that some numeracy words, like for example the word 100, aren't translated into home language, as that word 100 is most often used in the community. So we wanted to definitely reflect the girls' lives. So where girls are proficient in English, communities speak and teach with the girls in English. So if you were to go to a learning hub, the most likely model you would observe in the learning hubs would be this kind of idea of translanguaging across home language and English.
Thank you, Tom. And I just hope that sort of gives a flavour of the of how the different languages are used, and used really flexibly to encourage literacy, both in home language and in English. And just to say a few words about the unit story, like the one that you can see. And what we will do is we will sort of first off sort of get the girls to talk about the picture. So as Tom says, you don't need to read words, you're just talking about the picture, thinking about the topic. You know, ask what will happen next. So you're getting people thinking, imagining. And then we'll read the story in the girls' home language, so that there's practice And it's a community educator who will read the story so that the girls can concentrate on listening if they want to follow the story in words. Then if they're difficult words, girls are asked if there's any words that are new for them, and so that the meanings are discussed. So that's all about helping people understand what there is in front of them, keeping people engaged. Girls will then be talked about what's happened in the story. Was it what you thought would happen? Are you surprised? How do you feel about that? And then the story is read aloud by the communicator in English, so that the girls can get that experience in English. But all about that is about actually helping people have understanding, helping the girls reflect, think, and actually starting to use language. And then we'll build to actually doing something's about you, so you actually got some personal application. And over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. So my 20-minute time has just bonged exactly as you've handed over to me. So I think we're at the end of our time. If I could, I'd just like to share a couple of thoughts and reflections on what Claire said very quickly. Thank you, Neha. And the first is, Claire said at the beginning about kind of starting where the girls were. It looked at the literacy practices that they were already familiar with. It looked at the language use patterns that they were familiar with and how they might be different depending on whether or not the girl had reason to trade in English or would just be using the home language in her community. So there's that thing of starting where the learners are, both in terms of their context and their skills. But Claire also mentioned that the stories are chosen to help foster girls' ambition and to have a realization that there might be places and activities and lives beyond the life that they're currently experiencing and living that could be open to them. And for me, that kind of reflects Paulo Freire's notion that, you know, all education is a political act, and it's about helping people become empowered to change their lives and their circumstances. And I think you can see that reflected. So it's not just about learning the words from the letters, it's about actually fostering capacity for change. And I think the final thing that I'd just like to say is, you know, we see this kind of holistic approach in there. So it's drawing in the conversation, the reading, the use of pictures and understanding, and translanguaging, using a variety of languages at appropriate places. So it's not a kind of a small and discrete kind of formula for, well, we do this and we do this and we do this, but it speaks to something that's much more fluid and holistic in terms of how that will work in the girls' experience in the learning centres. Thank you, Neha.
Thank you very much. And at this point, I think let's take some time for all of us to put down our reflections and questions in the chat. It's good to put them down right now, as we've just heard Tom and Claire speak about, especially the SAGE project, the fact that what is literacy? It's a capacity building, you know, it's meant to foster capacity building to change lives. It's a very different perspective than what we started with, the words on, you know, what we saw on the word cloud in terms of saying reading and writing. So some thoughts and any questions? Can we take 30 seconds, all of us, and put that down in the chat and sip a little bit of water before we get on to hearing our next panelist. We also have this being streamed live on YouTube, and there would be, you know, comments and questions there. We invite comments and questions on YouTube too, we will be taking that in the session. Great. So I'm sure that we're going to keep this going, and everybody can continue accessing the chat. Thank you for sharing the, what is literacy, how does it matter, and how multilingualism, the different approaches in terms of, particularly when you said that, when we heard person speak and talk about flexibility, that you could build in flexibility in the teaching, and there's not just one way of teaching, and how children who are speaking different languages were very gradually they have transitioned into learning English. I think that was really wonderful. So let's now over to Kay Jacob, our next panelist, who's going to talk about her experience, her varied experience. One is that she's been in different cultures. Kay, so I know with our prior conversation, Kay told me that literacy is literacy different in different cultures? And Kay said, no, not really. That's not what it is.
Let me put that in the context also, that at least I'll explain that. I think are you ready for me to share my screen? Yeah, my PowerPoint.
Yes, you can.
Okay. All right. I have a very specific context that I'm talking about too, and I really appreciate Tom and Claire for presenting a broad perspective on literature, and I certainly agree. In our school, for example, we are now required by the state of Iowa to teach financial literacy to graduating seniors, and we also have tech literacy classes for our middle school kids. So it is true, absolutely true, that this has to fit the context. And so I'm going to say that literacy for me, in my context, what I'm talking about is directly from my experience working in secondary education, by which I mean actually middle school. I'm looking at middle school here, and I'm going to show you some strategies that we developed at the Heritage School in Gurgaon. And anybody who worked there during that time will recognize my examples because they come straight out of the work that we did there. So I should preface this by saying that that we also had a very strong early literacy program there, and that was in Hindi and English as well. So by the time the kids got into fourth grade, which is what Neha's talked about as being past that point of basic literacy being established, we were focusing on being able to use hands-on active learning, project-based learning, to teach concepts and to integrate skills across subject areas. But to do that, the students had to have very strong independent reading skills. So we introduced some strategies for getting them to be able to read informational texts, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So these are easy strategies to apply, actually, and I think this is all designed by teachers who worked in teams with our fourth grade through eighth grade classes. So that's actually my specific context. So my focus here is on using informational text to reinforce reading strategies simply by making sure that students find the main idea, identify supporting details, and read for inference, which is something that did not come obviously to all kids. Read between the lines, we can say. I think also one thing that we discovered at Heritage is the importance of making sure that students understood their learning targets in student-friendly language. So that's something else I'm going to talk about right now. So for my purposes, literacy is going to be defined as reading comprehension. I've worked in schools my entire life in several different places, but in schools that were structured for students of a certain social class who are ultimately going to go to college. So I think it's important to give that context also. Or they were going to go to higher education in some form. So my definition of reading comprehension as a function of literacy is an active process in which the reader constructs meaning from and I put alphabetical code alphabet in brackets because not all languages use phonetic alphabet approaches. So I'm not an expert in that, so I'm not even going to begin to go into that. But I've lived in cultures where there are different approaches. So anyway, meaning from a code by interacting with the text. So that's going to be my functional definition of literacy. And I think as we talked about this, before I actually put together this slideshow with Neha and others, we were talking about the fact that there is a possibility that kids can seem to be fluent without actually comprehending what they're reading. And that's a problem in schools where kids don't understand the language they're reading in, right? It's possible for them to actually decode the phonetic meaning of English texts and read them with accuracy of sound without being able to comprehend. So I think it's important to talk about fluency as the ability to read a text accurately and quickly while comprehending. And that does include much of what Tom and Claire had talked about, that there needs to be a grounding in understanding the language orally before reading can be achieved. And in this way, reading also automatically requires pausing at the right point. So intonation and comprehension go hand in hand in this. So I think that the most helpful thing from the teacher perspective is how do you monitor, how do you know when a student is comprehending? And then more importantly, how does the student know when they're comprehending? What do they do if they understand? What do they do if they don't understand? How do they know what strategies that a fluent reader is applying that they're not able to apply? And so understanding I think how we work with kids who are struggling with reading is critical to being able to structure good reading instruction. So these are some of the principles, and I took this from a relatively easily accessible site called readingrockets.org. A lot of stuff is free on there, or at least the last time I checked. And so this points out some strategies for monitoring comprehension. The ones who are good at reading know when they understand and what they read and what they read and when they don't. So they know how to fix their problems. So I think it's important to say that research is indicating that that instruction, even in the early grades, can help students become better at monitoring their comprehension. So you can give them overt sort of metacognizant strategies, even at a fairly young age, for being able to monitor their comprehension. So that's the premise there. It teaches them to be aware what they understand, identify what they don't understand, and then use the bridge strategies that you'd have to teach directly or eventually through guided practice, and then ultimately independently. So some of those strategies, sorry? I'm sorry? Oh, I thought I heard someone.
No, I think it was maybe by mistake, somebody's just unmuted.
That's fine. Although if I'm going too fast or anything, please do let me know. Or if there's anything that you are not able to follow, please let me know. So from a student perspective, this is what the learning targets look like, right? And we made extensive use of learning targets at Heritage. They were posted on the board. Sometimes the students themselves developed the learning targets along with the teacher, and we had them written in places. Kids would copy them down in their notebooks so that they understood. There's a lot of research led by somebody named John Hattie, which talks about the importance of assessment capable learners. And that's what you want to create. Students who can monitor their own learning. They know whether they're reaching their targets. They know if they're not reaching them, and they know how to get help if they're not also. So putting the targets in the hands of students is really powerful. So students knowing that the point of comprehension is to find the main idea. And again, I'm talking about informational text, reading in science or social studies or math or some subject that, even being able to figure out what the exam question is asking, right? These are all critical skills for where you need to find the main idea, identify supporting details in the text, and then ultimately use details and examples to explain explicit information and inferences. So these are things that once you tell students, and you can put them in these strategies in the hands of children as young as 4th grade, for sure, maybe even younger, that they know that this is what it's about. And they understand what is we'll talk about how to unpack the word explicit for them also, so they understand what that is and what inferences are. So close reading strategies encourage the student to mark up the text. Now you have to get kids to not be afraid of marking their text. So you need to give them accessible text. Now this is something that, you know, for even American kids who've been taught, never write in your book and don't mess with your text. It's a precious thing. But these are strategies for getting students to interact and highlight. And I continue to teach English classes in 9th and 11th grade. And I require, and this is true of our standards as well, are in America, that students mark up their text, that they actually interact with the text as a strategy for learning how to comprehend. So ideally read the whole text for flow, and then chunk it into smaller sections, then underline what I know, circle what I don't, and summarize along the way. So and good readers do this automatically, right? They summarize as they go, they comprehend as they go. But how many of us our minds have drifted? We've read 2 or 3 pages and we realize we haven't understood a thing we've read. It still happens to us as adults, right? So if we're not consuming the language as we go along, stopping and mentally checking to be sure we're understanding, I would even say writing brief summaries and main points in the margins. That's how we teach children to embed these strategies. So here's an example of a text that was thoroughly marked up. This comes directly from one of the expeditions, the topics, and that comes from the CBSE syllabus, or from the objectives about studying forests and the value of forests. And you can see that this is for a teacher has designed this to use with other teachers also. So this shows you how the text has been marked and what each of the, I don't know if you can read the little strategies along the side, but this is, you know, what sort of a metacognizant thing. Do I know what a forest is? Do I? Yes. Okay, well then, am I confident about that? And having kids think about the meaning of words. Do I know what firm means? Do I know what it means in this context? Okay, so actually studying the vocabulary, looking at what's important. These little notes on the side describe the thinking process of the students as they go through it. And I have to, again, hats off to my colleague who created this as a teaching tool for teachers to understand what it is we're asking students to do. And then you can use it with the students as well. So again, this is in the mind of the child, okay? Oh, this is a new word. How can I break it down into dis and appearing? Can I understand the word in context before I look it up in a dictionary? Can I look back at the context and see if I can understand it more broadly? Is it being used differently than my other experiences with this word? So the little thought bubble representing the students. I can certainly share this with people later on, but again, I credit the teachers at Heritage for creating this example of exactly what we want the students to do. So as we teach this, as we teach students to unpack text, we're also teaching them to ask and formulate questions which help them distinguish, again, between reading what the text says explicitly and what requires some inference or some broader knowledge. So this is a strategy also that you will recognize that kind of links to what we call Bloom's taxonomy or higher order thinking. You can actually, the question being earlier, how do you make sure that critical thinking is happening? You teach with rich enough texts that students have to make some inferences and they need to make applications outside of the textual context also. So how to do that is to lead them into being able to create their own questions as they're going along. And then you as a teacher would use these same types of questions to push them from literal interpretation up to higher order thinking. So this is the simple grid that you can use to get kids to identify questions that, first of all, ask for literal understanding and recall, and then push them. So we kind of call them right there. The answer is right there in the text. And I was sharing with Neha, as we were with the other people I was on too, about the first time I taught an 11th grade English class at Heritage. I decided if I was going to be the principal there, I needed to teach directly, and I needed to experience the CBSE syllabus itself. So I took on an 11th grade class. I thought I couldn't damage them too much there was no exam that year, right? So I took the humanities group, a group of kids who, were not interested in the maths and the sciences. So we could pick some literature that was a little more challenging for them. They were bright kids. So I gave them an unseen passage one day. And I looked at the kind of unseen passages they were asked to do. And I realized that actually they didn't have to read the passage to understand, to be able to answer the questions. All they needed to do was find the matching line from the multiple choices, right? So I found some other stuff on the internet. It was a reading comprehension passage, and it did have multiple choice questions after it, but they were a very different kind. They asked for inference. They gave choices A, B, or C, or two of the above, or one of the above. So they were actually was designed quite differently to force students. And I actually watched my students go straight to the questions, and then look back at the text, and then look at the questions again, and get very puzzled expressions on their faces, and then say, "Ma'am, this is not what we're used to." So I laughingly said, "Yeah, you're going to have to read the passage first, and then you'll be able to answer the questions," which they did, and they were perfectly capable of doing it. So most of the questions, even in multiple choice, were asking for something beyond knowledge, asking for comprehension and understanding, asking for analysis, which is answers that require some prior knowledge plus knowledge of the text. Okay, reading for inference, and then answers that expect them to apply and synthesize beyond what the text is saying. So these questions are fun. They enjoyed it, actually. They didn't mind once they figured out what they had to do. It didn't take them long to shift gears. And of course, they had to go back to the traditional kind when they got to their exam. But I felt as if we were able then to read texts. I was able to take on texts that were far more complex than what was available in the CBSE reader, which was very thin and very boring. So, we read the same sort of things I'd been doing in international schools by the end of that year. So, and they were, this was absolutely fine. Bright girls, mostly girls in that section, and very capable. So, again, I wanted to emphasize that we followed, we pushed them up, right? We pushed them up from what they remember and understand to what they could apply, analyze, evaluate, and ultimately create. And that's the point, isn't it? So that they take off from the text. When we worked with this at Heritage, they would eventually, for example, they did history projects on a particular history era, and then they would also, create pottery a lot with using the same strategies that the potters in those days did. And then they would go visit pottery village, where the potters sell their wares along the streets in Gurgaon, and actually interview people and extend it. We did a bicycle expedition. And if Jeshri were on, she would be able to talk about this, where the kids learned how to disassemble and reassemble bicycles, and they wrote their own manual. These are 6th and 7th graders. So to do that, they had to be able to read independently, and they needed to be able to write and think critically also. So that's what I have. I don't know if you have, I'm sure there may be some questions, or there may be there might be something that comes up in the chat that people might want to talk about. And if there's anything I went over too fast, I'm happy to go back and talk about that also.
Yeah. Should we just stop sharing the screen?
Yep.
So time to assimilate our thoughts, and you could put down what, if you have questions. There are already some questions in the chat, but I'd like everyone to take a few seconds after having heard Kay to pen down your thoughts or any questions that you may have. We've had two perspectives, one at the school level, where Kay spoke about how they managed within the mainstream curriculum within the given structure of how literacy is taught, how reading with comprehension, how that could be achieved. And we saw in another space of how that could be done, starting with the language that people knew, building from the illustrations and having conversations and moving ahead.
I would like to add also that while I was at Heritage, the Hindi teachers also began to use the same strategies when they taught Hindi. Same sorts of things. Look for main ideas, understand underlining and circling and making marginal notes. So it was really the synthesis across the two departments really helped to reinforce comprehension strategies. It was so much fun to work with them. I did use these. You also mentioned that there's a teacher training program through Heritage that was started by Smithy Den and other people, and I used these strategies with those teachers also, and then also did some training with the city Montessori schools in Lucknow. So same sorts of things, and it worked everywhere. I hope it did. I hope they're still benefited from it.
I'm sure we have people even from the city Montessori schools, and they'll definitely put that on.
Yeah, that was a while back though. I don't know. There was some. I met some amazing teachers there. It was really fun.
So we have some questions on the chat, and some are coming in. So let's try and take the questions. There is a question here for Tom and Claire as to what training or orientation do the educators get to be able to work with the learners? And that's Padmini's question.
I think that's
thank
probably
you. Yeah, thank you. As a sort of project team, we have, pre-COVID, we had sort of 2-day workshops at the start of each term. And in the first term, we also had a mid-term workshop. We have got sort of session guides, which are like very light sort of lesson plans to support the community educators, and you know, but a lot of it was discussion and reflection. I think when people started off, like Kay was saying, actually what they wanted to do with the stories was to get the children to sort of read the words, decode the words, and so that was the emphasis. And then there was a lot of discussion about how you could move actually to doing something like, you know, getting understanding, identifying new words. So that sort of training is, so it's been in sort of 2-day chunks, about on average once a term, but really about, you know, talking about inspirations that community educators have had, challenges they've found, what responses are they getting from the learners, but really sort of driven from those experiences. So it's not been sort of very theoretical. It's been actually, you know, how is this going with the girls, you know, and also talking about, as Kay says, you know, there are learning objectives for the girls. You know, what do you stand? What can you? How could you use this? And talking about those. So that's the sort of training that we've done, and it's ongoing and it's reflective. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that hope that addresses your question, Padmini. There's one more question, and that's particularly, you know, that's by Sister Gloria, and it's about how do we manage with students with different home languages to share their understanding? Because, you know, we have so many regional languages in India that a classroom would not have just one, you know, a child with just the Indian language, I mean the national language, but with a whole lot of, you know, somebody from the south, the west, the east, and every state has a different language and tribes of different language. So when we have children in the classroom, like how would they share their understanding? Any thoughts on that?
Well, Tom, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I'm not sure I've got a very sophisticated answer, but I think and what I see colleagues encouraging in those kind of circumstances is really to not be afraid of translanguaging. And so, you know, we would encourage teachers and students to kind of switch languages as they needed to make sure that people were understanding. And so, and I noticed there was a question there as well, how can you do this in 30 minutes if you've got 60 students in the class kind of thing? And I think, you know, it really is that kind of thing of actually pushing the discussion and the talk and the meaning making down to students and pairs particularly, but small groups of students, encouraging them to translanguage with each other. So, you know, if they're wrestling with the text in English, but, you know, one speaks Hindi and the other speaks Urdu, just kind of, you know, use what you've got to make meaning and make sense and communicate and make sense in the pairs. And then, you know, that pair tell the pair next to them what they made of it and which words they got and which they didn't, and did they get. So this should be, I think, when children are wrestling with text in the kind of way that Kay said around, you've done your close and your markup, but then children are comparing what they've got with the person next to them, or one pair with the pair next to them. I'd like to hear lots and lots of talk in lots and lots of languages in the kind of context that you're describing.
Kay, would you like to add to it?
Yeah, I would. One of the structural changes that we made at Heritage and that we have used in that I've used in most schools too is to put kids in groups. We called them crews. So they actually were seated in groups of maybe 5, 6 kids. It's a question of, and I know that some classrooms, especially in Lucknow, some of the classrooms had very limited space, but it's a question of just turning them toward each other rather than having them all facing the front, so that they could do the think, pair, share thing. Someone's asked, I see, how do you do this online? And I'm not sure what, I mean, if you have access to what we're using, Zoom, and you can make breakout rooms, kids can discuss, they can share a document. I realize some people don't have access to this level of technology probably, but you know, if you do, then that is a wonderful use of breakout rooms, and they can be sharing their strategies, they can create a Google Doc together. And I agree that it's, you know, discussing them among themselves, letting kids who have the same language inform each other and bridge to the English if they need to do that. So again, this is whatever it takes to be able to decode the text is fair game, I think, right?
Yes,
Neha, could I follow up on that thing about the
please,
online
please.
that Kay picked up on as well? I mean, I'm a really strong advocate of the kind of close reading that Kay mocked up, and my background, I used, when I was a teacher, I was a science teacher. But one of the things that really struck me when I was doing my teacher training, I read a paper where they'd looked at lessons in secondary schools and marked up how often children were introduced to new words that they didn't understand. And actually, they were introduced to new words they didn't understand twice as often in science as they were in foreign languages. And more in foreign languages than in English and literacy. So this thing of actually learning new words, comprehending, making meaning is not something that's limited to literacy or to language lessons. It's actually, you know, across the curriculum. And so that thing of marking up, of using underlining, of using circles, of using pens and pencils of different colors, marking different things out to, you know, where are the objects, where are the actions, what's going on, what, you know, how do we make sense of this text, I think is something that's really important for all learners and all subjects. And in online, I mean, I personally, in my own learning, that as I'm reading things now, I still do that kind of markup. And PDFs, online documents that you can download, have fantastic options for highlighting, for using colored circles, different colors. So I you know, making notes on the side. So I would really encourage students, if I was still teaching in that way, to be marking up text in the same way, but doing that with digital texts as well as with written texts.
Yeah, exactly. And then that they can get past their fear of ruining the book, which is very real.
Yes, we have Parveen asking a question saying, encouraging children to read non-fiction on their own is a struggle. How do we help them to do that? Any thoughts on that? Anybody could take that question.
Well, I think it's interesting that getting kids engaged in the topics that are interesting to them. I just did a research paper with my 9th graders. They had to do independent research on it. They could pick the topic. And so they did an amazing job. Then they had to find sources. By the way, I teach them to, you know, to avoid plagiarism. They have to make bibliography cards for each of their sources, and then they need to color code all of the information they get from that source so they correctly cite it in their paper. And you know, they that color coding thing, or even it extends to independent research also. But I found that if they could choose their topics, they were remarkably interested in it. I think you can use, there's a wealth of graphic novels and graphic stories and informational text that combine pictures with text also, and you know, kind of bridging them to reading online, whatever it takes to get them to reach out to where they're already fluent, and that they're far more fluent technologically than we are, probably, in terms of accessing things. I find high interest and high relevance to be extremely effective, right?
I think just something else I'd like to add is not making assumptions about where learners' sort of current reading level may be, and talking to teachers. Often you have a little classroom library, and and those books may be at the grade level, but many of the learners haven't got there yet. And so it has to be a book that actually, particularly if you're new to reading or reading for pleasure, where it's fun, it's exciting, but actually you can do it. And you get some confidence, because actually that's what we all want. If we're going to try something new, you have to feel encouraged. You have to feel, oh yeah, no, I'm getting this, or this is going well. And then that's what motivates you to go and take that next book, which might be a little bit harder. But actually I think it's about sort of really knowing where your learners are and making sure that there's books actually for where your learners really are, and that's important too.
Really good point. We also introduced some tests. We got it through Scholastic, which is is all over in India, so that kids could actually know what we call their Lexile scores. They actually could own their own reading levels and then bridge to the next higher level. So you're absolutely right that if they're being given texts that are all kind of words, no pictures, and way above their heads, they're certainly not gonna be interested.
I hope that answers your question too. Lots of ways in which we can have the children read books of their choice, and hopefully get addicted to reading as well. So that's a little, we are all finding that getting to actually reading books in this space where there's a lot of stuff available on screen is getting, I think that's also being one of the problems that we are experiencing. We have one question that's from Gayatri, who's on the YouTube live, where she said, why could learning and literacy be considered very closely related? Okay, I'm really not able to understand in terms of what are we trying to say?
Might want her to unmute.
Yeah, no, I think she's on the YouTube chat. So Gayatri, if you're still there, if you could just explain what you meant by the question, that would be very useful. And we could take that up before we wind up the session. Just further scrolling on for questions. Okay, we have, when we are talking about switching languages may not be welcome for a teacher in most English medium schools, was one of the comments, and that was made by Sheila.
I'm glad you picked that one up, Neha. Could I?
Please
I'd
go
like
ahead.
to respond to that if I could.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think as an educator, for me, one of the things that I'm most concerned about, though, is communication and understanding. Between the teacher and the students, and between students themselves. It's just kind of are we communicating? Are we and are we being understood? And I just come back to that figure that we mentioned in the presentation earlier, that 40% of the children are taught in a language they don't speak and don't understand, and I personally find that just pains me. So I think whatever the language policy of the school is, my overriding concern would be actually, if I'm trying to communicate with this child, or I'm asking them to communicate with the person next to each other, are they managing that? Are we managing that, and are we understanding what's being communicated? And if we can do that in the medium of instruction, fantastic. And if let's have several different goes at that and try putting things in different ways. But actually, if you can't get through in that, and you've got another language that's available. I would just want to get on to the point where you were confident that the child understood what was happening. I think there's nothing more heartbreaking than a child sat in a lesson simply not understanding what's going on.
We had the same challenges at Heritage because kids were most comfortable, not necessarily most fluent, but most comfortable in Hindi. So that's what they would speak in the corridors and socially. And, so it was an effort also to make sure they could do it. Not all of them equally, of course, but and I do completely understand. We did want them to be using English and in their conversations also. And even now at my international school, we are trying to push kids who are native speakers of Chinese or Vietnamese or whatever to actually use English to communicate and to increase their fluency. But it's true that if they're not able, we have two choices. Either they're completely lost, so we need to give them a simpler English text to read while the other kids are reading a complex text, which I often do with a couple of my students, or we need to let them bridge to their native language if they're struggling. And there's such sophisticated translation apps on phones and stuff. It's not hard, and if you look at a kid with a completely blank expression on their face and you can give them just one or two vocabulary words that they can go, oh, and suddenly they're with you, why would you not do that? And, so it is a tension. I completely recognize that, but getting them back on track is really what you're trying to do.
Absolutely, thank you. And there's one more question from Susan says, and this is Claire for you. How might this look with very young learners compared to adolescent learners? I guess this is with regards to the case study that you were sharing.
Yes, thank you. I mean, for me, the principles would be the same. In that you want to get texts that are relevant and interesting and motivating for the children. Now, clearly, if they're a younger age, those texts are going to be very different, but the same principle applies. You'd, want to talk to children to see what they were interested in, so you could reflect that in the texts and the literacy that you were learning. And again, I mean, I think things about actually, just starting off with picture reading and getting the very, very strong visual images, and just all those sort of simple things about, what's this about, what might happen next. So I think all those things you can do with very young children. The actual texts and everything else will be very different, but actually it's that confidence you want to build, it's that interest, and it's that feeling that actually language is for you as a learner to use. It's not what somebody else has supplied on a piece of paper. Actually, it's something that you use yourself. And I think if we can get that through to really young learners, now I think that's huge, because then they can take that with them through the rest of their schooling. And particularly at the moment, when many learners are having to be more independent, if you don't have that sort of confidence, that ability to understand and express, you're going to really struggle. So I think it is about applying those principles, but being really clear that it's absolutely targeted at the interests and where those learners are. Thank you.
Could I just add to that, Claire? And I think one of the other things that we encourage for very young learners, and particularly thinking about the question of language that came up earlier, if you're working in a second language, one of the things is getting children to talk about and name and count the things around them and stuff like that. And quite often teachers are encouraged to do things like have labels in the target language of things like, the blackboard, the door, the window, and we can then start talking about that and having games of saying, well, okay, everyone in this group go to the door, everyone in that group go to the window, count how many windows there are. So I think that thing's about engaging with the environment that's around you and using your language in that context. And also for very young learners, of course, things like songs and rhymes and games are really important as well, so that the learning's enjoyable and fun. It's not all about the text.
Great. Shamim, you've asked a question on the school level saying how to replace rote learning attitude in students, some strategy, And I think we've got a lot of strategies that were discussed in terms of what the teacher can do, to get the students engaged. So I hope that that's something you've been able to catch on. Is there anything that anybody would like to add to that? Kay, it's about replacing rote learning attitude. I think it's more about trying out the different strategies to engage the children.
Yeah, I realized the sun has suddenly come into my window. I have weird threads in my place.
Yeah.
But sorry about that. Anyway, I really did find, and this was with 11th graders or 5th or 6th graders, that if the students can become, I mean, we do have to believe in the innate quality of the desire to learn and the ability to learn in our students, and that authentic learning is its own reward. And if we can give them some real life application, or they can extend to their own interests, and they can share with their friends, and they can find the reward, the intrinsic reward in learning, plus the extrinsic reward in accomplishing the goals or getting the assessment grade they want or whatever, it does become its own reward. I mean, learning is exciting, and we talk about how when little kids start school, they're thrilled with the idea that they get to be in school, they get to learn, So keeping that inherent desire to learn, that's, I think, in the nature of humans, alive, by giving them what they're interested in and allowing them to become independent, self-driven learners, is, I think they'll never go back. That's true with teaching too. Teachers who have crossed over from rote teaching to guided practice and watching their students get engaged will never go back either.
Yeah,
I don't think,
Absolutely. So the 2 minutes to close the session, and thank you everybody for putting in all these questions and making this session really engaging. And I invite Kavita to actually close the session, summarize the session, and close it for all of us. Yes, Kavita.
Oh, I'm not going to summarize the session.
That's fine.
Available. I think what I'm going to say is really thank you so much for this, because it's been so important for us to, as educators, I feel that teaching is an essential service. It cannot be just seen as something that can be dropped the minute there's a crisis. And all our lives, we've been talking about schools which can continue to function in any circumstances. And this is something that we feel is going to really help all the educators in our community of practice to look at what is it that we can actually fundamentally teach, what is it that we really need to push, and how do we ensure that the children stay engaged and stop worrying about the size of the syllabus and what has to be covered and how much of the examination is to be focused on. This is about learning. This is about ensuring that we keep learning and that the students keep learning. And I think that's so simple. If that stays alive, if that curiosity and the desire to learn stays alive, and once a child has become independently capable of learning, you try stopping them, right? So that's just the whole thing, that we want to get that excitement out to the children, to say, there is here we are, not here to police you, to tell you what to learn, when to learn, and how to learn it, but to say, this is what is your tools of your learning, and please go for it. So with that way of being able to continue to keep the students engaged, the ones that we are able to reach, and to remember that we have to keep thinking about how to reach the ones that are not in touch with us. I'll close the session with a big thank you to all three of you, and to Neha and to the Adhyayan team for having managed this so well. And we will have the next two sessions, continue to stay engaged. I can see this has really hit a chord, because we're full up here. There's people on YouTube watching. So, thank you guys. You've been so wonderfully relevant and so authentically important. So
yeah.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful to do this. Anything I can do to help India at this time of struggle with the challenges you've got, please call on me.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
See you.